Hey guys, we started talking about Congress, right? We started talking about the House of Representatives and the Senate, and we looked at a little bit about how each of those, how representation is based in each of those. So in the Senate, right, we have two senators per state. Every state has the same number. Now, when we look at the House of Representatives, that's very different. They have very different numbers, and it's supposed to be based on population, and it's at least roughly based on population. So let's look at a little bit about how it's determined what the population is and where these representatives are actually going to be representing. Okay, and this brings us to a topic called reapportionment and gerrymandering. These are really big issues in politics today. There's something that's very contentious, and I think it's actually really fun to try and understand how this works. So reapportionment is something that happens every 10 years. It's based on the census, which is happening right now, and one of the reasons why it's so important. And what it does is it determines how many representatives a state will have, right? A state like California has a huge amount. A state like Nebraska has very few, okay? We get our representatives based on how many people live in our state, okay? When we look back to 1929, where this Reapportionment Act came about, it limited the House of Reps to 435 people. Okay, so as our population grows, that number stays the same. Now, as our population grows in California relative to other states, we might gain representatives, whereas they might actually lose representatives. So states like Texas, for instance, have a huge number of people moving there. They are getting more representatives, where maybe some other states in the Midwest are losing population and they actually lose their representation. Okay, that's a big deal. And the other part to keep in mind that goes along with this is that, like, as populations shift in different places, their representatives do too. Okay, so maybe places will lean more liberal or lean more conservative over time as their population changes. Okay, so we see this map, right? We see in 2010, this is 10 years ago now, but some of these states are gaining population. People are moving to them. They cost less to live in than a place like California, so they're gaining seats. See, Texas had gained 4. I bet they gained even more, or are going to gain more in 2020. Other states, the Rust Belt, the South, they're losing population. What implications does gaining or losing a seat have? What does that mean for a state? Well, the big thing here is that the amount of power that the state has, the amount of amplification that the voices of the people in that state have, is increases or decreases in the federal government, and so that can be a big issue. Now, once we've determined the number of total representatives that each state's going to have, the lines for where these representatives actually represent get redrawn as well. And this is a process called redistricting. And this is really the controversial process. This is where that comes in. Okay. So Texas, for example, gained 4 seats, right? They go from 32 to 36. Okay. And this is what their congressional map looks like. This is kind of a headache, right? There's tons and tons and tons and tons of representatives in these maps. And now the lines need to get redrawn because the population has shifted to represent the population. Okay, so these districts are supposed to be one person and one vote, more or less. Okay, and so when they redraw these boundaries, they have to take that into account. Okay, they can't be vastly disproportionate. They're not always perfect, but they can have huge disparities. And then the districts also must connect, okay? We'll see some examples of this soon, but you can't have a district here and you can't have a district here and say it's the same district. The district has to be contiguous. It has to be part of the part of the same whole, okay? And then the other piece of this is that they can't discriminate based on race. Now, that's always a tough one because there's a lot of ways that race discrimination happens, and it's not always so overt. So there's a few cases that have decided law on this. Courts actually have a lot of sway over this whole process of apportionment. Okay. Westbury versus Sanders. This is where we get this idea of having one person, one vote. Okay. And then again, Shaw versus Reno, we have this idea of race. Okay. And this is really where gerrymandering comes into play. Many people believe that it's used to target and to eliminate the voice of racial minorities. And we're going to look at that a little bit more, how that can actually happen. So gerrymandering is the process of making these boundaries for districts work to an advantage of one political party over another political party. Okay, so you end up with these districts, if you look here, that are shaped very oddly, right? Very strange shapes. Okay, this one is actually contiguous. I believe it's touching right here. So rather than it just being a big square, okay, with the same number of people, these lines are drawn in very tricky ways. Well, why is that a problem? Well, it's a problem because what can happen is that the political party that is in power in the state at the time is the one who gets to make these decisions about how district lines are going to be drawn. Okay, so if the Democratic Party is in control in a certain state, they can divide these lines to favor Democrats. Okay, it's really tricky, but these are the tactics that are used. There's packing, okay, which is when a party tries to pack people of an opposing party into very few districts as possible. And so what that does is it allows the other districts to swing in favor of that party. And then there's cracking, okay? And so that is dividing the concentration of the opposing party to dilute their political power overall. Let's take a look at what this looks like.
Most people have heard the word gerrymandering once or twice, probably during a presidential election. What exactly is gerrymandering? Essentially, it's the process of giving one political party an advantage over another political party by redrawing district lines. It's like Democrats trying to gain an advantage over Republicans, or Republicans trying to gain an advantage over Democrats. You see, each party wants to gain as many districts as possible so they can do things like control the state budget or set themselves up to win even more districts in the future. So, to understand how this process began and how it continues today, we must go back to 1812 in Massachusetts. Elbridge Gerry, the governor of Massachusetts, supported and signed a bill to allow redistricting. That is, redrawing the boundaries that separate districts. The catch? The new lines would favor Gerry's own political party, the Democratic-Republican Party, which no longer exists. You see, Gerry wanted his party to win as many state Senate seats as possible. The more members of your party who vote, the more likely you are to win an election. The new lines were drawn to include loads of areas that would help Governor Gerry in the future. They were so strange-looking that someone said the new districts looked like a salamander. The Boston Gazette added Gerry's name to the word salamander, and voila, gerrymandering, the process of dividing up and redrawing districts to give your political party an advantage. So how exactly does someone go about protecting their own political party and actually gerrymandering a district? There are two successful practices: packing a district and cracking a district. Packing is the process of drawing district lines and packing in your opponents like cattle into as few districts as possible. If more districts equals more votes, the fewer the districts there are, the fewer votes the opposition party will get. Packing, then, decreases the opponent's voter strength and influence. Cracking is the opposite, taking one district and cracking it into several pieces. This is usually done in districts where your opponent has many supporters. Cracking spreads these supporters out among many districts, denying your opponent a lot of votes. When you have a large number of people who would generally vote for one type of party, those folks are known as a voting bloc. Cracking is a way to break that all up. So when would a party choose to pack their opponent's districts rather than crack them? Well, that really depends on what the party needs. To dilute your opponent's voters, you could pack them into one district and leave the surrounding districts filled with voters of your own party. Or, if you and your party are in power when it's time to redraw district lines, you could redraw districts and crack up a powerful district and spread your opponent's voters out across several neighboring districts. So, Governor Jerry in 1812 wanted to gain an advantage for his party and redrew district lines in his state in such a crazy way, we have a whole new word and way of thinking about how political parties can gain advantages over their opponents. Politicians think of creative ways to draw districts every few years. So, the next time an election comes around and politicians ask people to vote, be sure to look up the shape of your district and the districts that surround it. How wide does your district stretch across your state? Are all of the districts in your state relatively the same shape? How many other districts does your district touch? But always be sure to ask yourself, does my district look like a salamander?
Okay, so the reason why that this can be an issue is because of the packing, because of the cracking. The people who are elected for office don't always represent what the actual population is. They represent how, some kind of sneaky way of dividing up the population. They don't represent all of the people, though. They represent these weird, oddly shaped districts. Okay, it favors people who are already in office, and has been shown time and time again that it negatively impacts minority communities. Now, a lot of times the redistricting directly targets those minority communities. Let's take a look at this to understand how these techniques work a little bit better.
So, you want to know what gerrymandering is? First, let's start with Government 101. In the United States, each state elects a certain number of representatives based on the state's population. The larger your population, the more representatives you have. Each representative represents a district, or a geographical area including its voters. Ideally, we want to have a range of representatives who reflect the political views of the population across the state. But how do we decide who gets to vote for each representative? Let's look at an example. Suppose we have a very tiny state of 50 people. 30 of them belong to the blue party and 20 belong to the red party. And just our luck, they all live in a nice even grid with blues on one side of the state and reds on the other. Now, let's say we need to divide the state into 5 districts. Each district will send one representative to the House to represent the people. Fortunately, because our citizens live in a neatly ordered grid, it's easy to draw 5 lengthy districts, 2 for the reds and 3 for the blues. Voila! Perfectly proportional representation, just as the founders intended. Now, let's say instead that the blue party controls the state government, and they get to decide how the lines are drawn. Rather than draw districts horizontally, they draw them vertically, so that in each district there are 6 blues and 4 reds. With a comfortable blue majority in the state, each district elects a blue candidate to the House. The blues win 5 seats, and the reds don't get a single one. Oh well. Finally, what if the red party controls the state government? The reds know they're at a numerical disadvantage, but with some creative boundary drawing, they can slice the blue population up such that they only get a majority in 2 districts. So despite making up 40% of the population, the reds win 60% of the seats. Not bad. This process of redrawing district lines to give an advantage to one party over another is called gerrymandering, and it's nothing new. The term gerrymander is named after early 19th century Massachusetts Governor Elbridge Gerry, who redrew the map of the Senate's districts in 1810 in order to weaken the opposing Federalist Party. Our example is, of course, a huge simplification. In the real world, people don't live in neatly ordered grids sorted by political party. But for politicians looking to give themselves an advantage at redistricting time, the process is exactly the same, and the consequences are very real. Gerrymandering is at least partly to blame for lopsided representation in the House seen in recent elections. And, it's been argued by the president, for political polarization, since representatives don't have to compromise hardline views in order to win seats.